The fluorescent lights of Hargrove Tower hummed at a frequency that only the night shift workers ever truly heard. That low, persistent drone that lived somewhere between a hum and a headache, wedged into the skull, like a splinter no one could reach. Marcus Delacroix had memorized that sound over 7 years of pushing a mop across the marble floors of one of Chicago's most prestigious financial buildings. He knew which tiles clicked when you stepped on them wrong, which elevator doors groaned before they opened, which janitor's closet on the 14th floor smelled like the ghost of someone's forgotten lunch. He knew this building, the way a man knows a prison, intimately, bitterly, and with a kind of love he'd never fully admit to. It was, after all, what kept the lights on at home. It was what kept his daughter Lily in her asthma medication, and her second-hand ballet slippers, and the strawberry cereal she absolutely refused to eat if anyone called it the wrong brand name. Marcus was 34 years old, and had the hands of a man 20 years older, cracked at the knuckles, roughened at the palms, with a long white scar running from the base of his left thumb to his wrist, where a broken bottle had introduced itself to him during a fight he hadn't started, but had been too principled to walk away from, back in his early 20s. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair, going silver at the temples far too early, and dark brown eyes that most people never bothered to look into for long enough to notice how sharp they were. That was perhaps the most important thing about Marcus Delacroix that the world consistently and catastrophically overlooked. How sharp those eyes were. How much they took in. How much they had always taken in, even when he was a kid growing up in Englewood, with second-hand textbooks, and a mother who worked 2 jobs, and a father who had chosen the road over his family. Before Marcus was old enough to understand what that choice meant, he was mopping the 42nd floor corridor at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday when he heard it, the argument. 2 voices, both male, both elevated beyond professional propriety, bleeding through the glass walls of the corner conference room. Marcus slowed his mop strokes instinctively. Not out of nosiness, but out of the practiced caution of a man who had learned that being invisible meant staying quiet and staying still when the powerful people around you were losing their composure. The last thing any janitor needed was to be noticed during someone else's crisis. But then one of the voices said something that made him stop completely. It said, in sharp, clipped French, "Ce contrat est une escroquerie absolue. Vous essayez de me voler." And the other voice, the American one, laughed. Low, dismissive, the laugh of a man who believed he had already won. Marcus stood very still. He understood every word. He had not expected to understand every word. But then, the world had never really asked Marcus Delacroix what he understood. The American voice belonged to Clifton Hargrove III. Anyone who worked in that building knew Clifton Hargrove III, the way sailors know a storm. By reputation first, by devastation second. He was 51 years old, silver-haired, possessed of a jaw that looked carved from expensive marble, and a smile that newspapers called disarming, and that his employees privately called something far less flattering. He was the 3rd generation of Hargroves to run Hargrove Capital, and he had spent his entire adult life expanding the family empire with the particular ruthlessness of a man who had never once needed to consider what happened to the people on the losing end of his transactions. The French-speaking voice belonged to a man Marcus had seen in the building twice before. Short, nervous-looking, with an ill-fitting suit and the energy of someone who had traveled a long way and was beginning to regret it. His name, Marcus would later learn, was Edouard Beaumont, and he was the representative of a small Martinique-based cooperative of agricultural workers who had pooled their life savings, their land titles, and 20 years of collective labor into a single bid to partner with Hargrove Capital on a Caribbean resort development that would, according to the proposal they had signed 3 months ago, give them permanent equity stake and community profit sharing in perpetuity. What Edouard had just been handed, what he was currently holding with visibly trembling fingers, was not that agreement. Marcus couldn't see the document from where he stood in the corridor, but he understood from the rapid-fire French that Edouard was unleashing that it was a replacement contract. A swap, a 60-page document written entirely in dense legal French that bore almost no resemblance to the original English-language terms Edouard's cooperative had agreed to. And Clifton Hargrove was laughing, because he had just bet his associate, loudly enough for the corridor to hear, that the janitor mopping outside couldn't read a single line of French. He said it with the casual cruelty of someone disposing of a fact that didn't matter, the way you'd point at furniture and say it can't speak. Marcus felt something cold and clear move through him. He had felt it before. It was the feeling of a door opening. Clifton Hargrove had not built a $2 billion empire by being reckless. He had built it by being precise in his calculations, precise in his timing, and absolutely, surgically precise in identifying the moment when a person on the opposite side of a negotiating table could be made to feel small enough to sign anything. The French contract swap was not an accident. It had been prepared by his legal team over 6 weeks, quietly commissioned in Paris through a third-party firm with no direct ties to Hargrove Capital, and it was a masterpiece of obfuscation, dense, technical, full of subordinate clauses nested inside subordinate clauses like Russian dolls of deception. The equity clause had been replaced with a licensing structure. The profit sharing had become a one-time buyout ceiling buried in Article 14, subsection C, paragraph 9. The land protections were gone entirely, replaced with a 30-year lease arrangement that reverted full ownership to Hargrove Capital upon any default, however minor. It was, as Edouard had screamed in French, an absolute swindle, but Clifton Hargrove spoke no French, had never needed to, and had surrounded himself with a legal team that was paid handsomely to ensure he never would. His associate that evening was Derek Price, his head of acquisitions, who had been present for the contract preparation, and who was now standing near the window with his jacket folded over his arm, watching the scene with the mild interest of a man watching a tennis match he already knew the outcome of. It was Derek who had spotted Marcus through the glass. It was Derek who had said, quietly smirking, "Bet the janitor can't read a word of it." And Clifton, in the expansive, untouchable mood of a man closing a deal, had said, "2 million says he can't read a single paragraph." He meant it as a joke. He meant it the way powerful men mean things when they've forgotten that other people can hear them, carelessly, thoughtlessly, as punctuation to a cruelty already in progress. Marcus Delacroix heard every word. He stood in the corridor with his mop handle loose in his left hand, and his jaw set, and his sharp dark eyes completely still. He was doing the calculation that he had been doing his entire life. The calculation of whether the cost of being sit was worth the consequence of staying invisible. Lily's face appeared in his mind. Not dramatically, not cinematically, just there, the way it always was. 7 years old, gap-toothed, stubborn, already reading at a 5th grade level, because her father had read to her every single night since she was 6 months old, in English, in French, in the fragments of Creole, his grandmother had pressed into him like coins pressed into a child's palm for safekeeping. He pushed open the conference room door. The room went silent with the specific, insulted silence of men who have never been interrupted by someone carrying a mop. Clifton Hargrove turned slowly, with the deliberate pace of a man who has perfected the art of making others feel they are interrupting something sacred. His eyes moved from Marcus's face to his uniform to the mop bucket, visible through the open door, and then back to his face, and the look that crossed Clifton's features was the precise, undisguised expression of a man cataloging someone as beneath his notice before deciding on reflection to be amused. "Can I help you?" Clifton said, in the tone reserved for waitstaff who arrive without being called. Marcus looked at Edouard first. The man was rigid with shock. Shock at the intrusion, yes. But also something else. A flickering, desperate thing behind his eyes that recognized, perhaps on pure instinct, that something had just shifted in the room. Marcus looked at the contract in Edouard's hands. He looked at Clifton Hargrove. He said calmly, in perfect Parisian French, without accent, without hesitation, the French of someone who had studied it for 12 years, who had won a full scholarship to the University of Illinois, on the strength of a language thesis, who had been 2 semesters from a law degree when his mother's stroke and a newborn daughter, and a world that did not pause for grief, had rerouted his entire life into a janitor's uniform. He said, "Monsieur Hargrove, vous venez de faire un pari à $2 millions. Je vous propose de l'honorer." Clifton Hargrove stared, Derek Price stared. Edouard Beaumont made a sound that was not quite a word but contained in its short syllable an entire season's worth of relief. Marcus held out his hand for the contract. He said in English, quietly, evenly, looking directly into Clifton Hargrove's eyes, with the full weight of 7 years of being looked through, and the full clarity of a man who has nothing to lose and knows it. "I'll read every paragraph, out loud. And then I'll tell Mr. Beaumont exactly what you've done to his contract, and exactly what the original terms were supposed to say, clause by clause in both languages. And you're going to sit there and listen to all of it." He paused. "Unless, of course, you'd like to withdraw the bet and the contract." The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere below 42 floors down, the city of Chicago moved in its enormous, indifferent nighttime rhythm. Clifton Hargrove's jaw was a perfect hard line. Derek Price was no longer looking mildly interested. And Marcus Delacroix, single father, night shift janitor, man with the cracked hands and the silver temples and the sharp, dark, absolutely relentless eyes, stood in the center of the room and waited, with the patience of someone who had been waiting his entire life for exactly this moment, and had, without ever planning it, been preparing for it every single day. Hargrove reached into his breast pocket, slowly, and placed his phone face up on the conference table. His thumb moved to the recording function. He looked at Marcus with something that was not quite respect and not quite fear but lived in the narrow, uncomfortable territory between the two, the look a man gets when he realizes, too late, that the world he thought he understood has corners he never bothered to map. "Go ahead," he said. His voice was perfectly controlled. Only his eyes betrayed him. Marcus took the contract from Edouard's hands. He sat down at the head of the table. He turned to page 1, and he began